Welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast with the staff of Threads magazine. I'm your host, Carol Frazier, and I'm joined today by Janine Clegg. Hi, Janine.
Hi, Carol.
Today we're joined by our guest, Mary Ray, a former associate and contributing editor to Threads. Mary's career in the sewing industry has been long and varied. She's worked in fabric stores, designed custom bridal couture, and taught workshops across the country at conferences, expos, retreats, and through a class on craftsy.com. Her award-winning wearable art has been featured in shows and galleries. Mary recently retired from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. She taught classes in apparel construction, flat pattern design, and, of special interest to us today, in sustainability in the apparel industry. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, back at Threads.
I know, it's really nice to see you, Mary. It's been a long time, I feel. I think I met you at least 20 years ago when you were leaving Threads and I was coming in. So we've kind of known each other for a while. And you've done a lot of different things in the meantime. So what I would love to start out with is the most recent thing that you did was this teaching gig that you had at Appalachian State. And I know that you developed a program on sustainability in fashion. And my first question for you is, how do you define sustainability?
Wow, I always think that's kind of a hard thing. You know, I think of that word as being relatively new. When I was young, we called it conservation. And what we really were trying to do was preserve what we have. In nature mostly. But sustainability really, to me, means that what you have, the life you have, is going to continue, and that when you, and particularly when we talk about garments, that they're not going to be harmful to our world. And we know that the whole idea of garments and garment production and textile production is extremely harmful. So when I developed this class in sustainability, I did so because actually our university, and pardon me for correcting you, Carol, but it is Appalachian. They're very proud
of that. I'm sorry.
That it's Appalachian. No, that's okay. But you know, there are a lot about sustainability, and it seemed like our program in apparel needed to address that. You know, we have to wear clothes. We can't get around that. And most of us like clothes. We like changes of clothes. And in the sewing industry, we like making those clothes. And how can we do it in the best way we can? We're not going to stop wearing and making clothes as an industry or as individuals, but how can we do it better? And that's kind of what I think about when I think about sustainability.
Mary, if we could just back up for a second, and could you just explain why making of textiles and making of garments is not sustainable? Can you give us some examples of why it has not been?
Well, it hasn't been because it just takes so much to make a garment. And so often we don't think about that. You go into a store, you see clothes on a rack, and they're there. We think they've always been there. And that's where they come from. I mean, I know there are young people that think food comes from grocery stores, and that's it. You know, they have no idea where it starts. It's very toxic from the very beginning of a garment, which is the fiber, whether it's cultivated from the ground or from a worm or from an animal, or whether it's produced in a test tube. It all takes a lot of energy. And then once you have the fiber, it's turned into cloth, and the cloth gets dyed or printed. You know, that again takes an extreme amount of energy. And then making that into the garments, that takes energy. And shipping those garments off somewhere takes energy. It just goes on and on and on in the supply chain. So we really don't think about it as being such a harmful industry, but I have always heard that it's second only to the oil industry in terms of pollution in the world.
Are there particular fibers that are better or worse than others in terms of the level of pollution they produce or the level of energy they consume to create them?
Well, I think that in some ways, sometimes the fibers that we think are the least harmful, like cotton, for example, that uses quite a bit of water. Even though it is a sustainable, regenerative crop, it it can be quite harmful for that reason. But now there are a lot of things that are happening in the various industries, the fiber industries, that they are trying to make a difference. And I think the cotton industry is definitely one of those. We also know that now there is a lot of organic cotton being grown. We don't always get a choice when we either purchase a garment or yards of fabric. We don't know sometimes what the process has been. I always think of fabrics like linen as being slightly less harmful to the environment. And hemp, for example, although we don't see a lot of that, certainly by the yard we don't see that. But sometimes the natural fibers are considered the least harmful. Alpaca actually is supposed to be quite a lot more sustainable than other fibers. Then we go to the manufactured fibers like polyester. Well, we know that polyester is certainly made from fuels and has it's basically plastic and has a lot of harmful problems. But then on the other hand, polyesters can be recycled more easily, I think, than almost any other fiber. Although a lot of the natural fibers now are being, especially cotton, are being recycled as well. I think that wool in itself is a little gentler, but then there are all of these same processes like dyeing and printing and whatever that go into the construction of that fabric, and that adds to I guess the problems that any industry like the textile industry has.
I wonder too if the whole recycling process also adds to the consumption of energy and resources, finite resources. When you're trying to recycle textiles, isn't there a process, use of water, use of other resources to make garments from recycled textiles?
That's an issue, I think, when we try to be sustainable in every area. Sometimes what you do to correct something is perhaps almost as harmful as the initial process. And I think it is something that we, a lot of the recycling. Now, where I live here, I live in a rather large development, and we have big recycle bins down. Well, I live on top of I'm not going to say it's a mountain. We're on top of a mountain. I'm on top of a hill. So we go down to the entrance of the development, and they have big recycle bins there. We can bring a lot of things and put it in these recycle bins, which we do. But is it really being recycled? That's kind of the question. Now, I don't take clothing or anything like that, but there is a process for doing this. The positive thing about this is that now these industries are aware of what they're doing. They're being made aware, and they are making at least some steps in trying to change what has been happening. And I think that's positive, that at least there are steps being taken in the clothing and textile industry. In the textile industry, and that's the part that probably really affects the home sewer in a way, because that's the point in the supply chain that we as sewers, we purchase fabric, and now it's up to us what we're going to do with it. In the manufacturing stage, obviously, there is, when you buy clothing, it's already made, and you have to make decisions then what you're going to purchase. But I think there are some real positive things happening, and we can look at the whole industry as doom and gloom, and oh my goodness, what do we do? We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. But I do feel that there is a lot of positive things happening in the industry.
Mary, what would be a way for a home sewer to know what kind of fabric they're buying? I mean, are there certifications that you can look for that tell you this fabric was produced in a more environmentally responsible way?
There are some things, but I don't know if we're seeing them yet in most fabric stores. Now, I have seen on, I believe it's Emma Onesock's website, that she has fabrics that she labels as Ecotex. Now, those are kind of fabrics that are to be less harmful. And there are sites that sell organic cotton and will label things in that way. But then there are other times, and I know this, when there are certain fabric vendors that don't always exactly know what's in those fabrics. And the fabric industry is huge, and it has many different ways of getting fabric to us. I used to work in retail fabric, and as a buyer, you can buy directly from the manufacturers, but a lot of times you're buying from jobbers where they're getting their fabrics from designers, leftover designers. That's a good thing when you think about it, because that means the clothing manufacturers aren't throwing it away. They're letting somebody else purchase it. But you don't always know. And I know I've been in fabric stores where they will do a little burn test for you, but that sometimes is problematic as well. And the truth is that there are fabrics that you can't tell what they are. I have had silks that feel like wool, and certainly polyesters that feel like silk. And some of the manufactured fabrics today, I think, are so good in mimicking the natural fabrics that it's really hard to tell just by feeling the fabric if you don't have a label on it. I don't really think that in fabric. Now, in garments, they are required to list the fiber content, but I'm not sure that's true for fabric stores that are selling by the yard.
That's possibly true. Mary, I think a lot of people who make their own clothing are natural fiber snobs. We don't want to use any synthetics. Right. But I mean, I'm wondering, do you think that there might be a justification occasionally for using synthetic fibers if they have been produced in a way that might be more conscious of the effect that it creates to make those?
There can be. I mean, certainly, I think if you have the opportunity to purchase a fabric that has been made out of other things. Now, I mean, I'm with you, Carol. I love natural fibers, and I always have. But that's not true with everyone, and certainly I've found it's not necessarily true with younger generations because they're used to a lot of these manufactured fibers. And there are several companies that are making things out of recycled polyester, for example, which is a good thing because it is that circular kind of economy, and I think I mentioned that when we were putting this together, that would try to get away from what is linear, whereas the linear aspect is you take the resources, whatever the fiber is going to be, and you make something out of it, and then it gets disposed of. Straight line. But circular, you take that fiber, you make something out of it, you use it. In terms of clothing, I like to think you repair it when it needs repair. You keep it going. Maybe you give it to somebody else, but it keeps on going. But it's made out of something that will then be disposable in such a way that it's almost like compost. It will be there to become something else. I mean, that was kind of the theory behind cradle to cradle. And I don't know if the readers have heard of this, but this was William McDonough and Michael Baumgart that wrote this book about cradle to cradle, where everything is in a cradle to grave situation. It circulates. And I think we can imagine that more when we think about food. I know we have compost bins. We try to at least keep that going. But that can be done with other things as well. Maybe not in the sense, in the way it is now, but the textile industry, I think those that really are responding to this are trying to create textiles that will be able to be disposed of in a way that they're not going to end up being what they are forever. If we used to talk about plastic like that if it ends up in a landfill, it's always going to be plastic hundreds of thousands of years from now.
So it can be used again in some way.
Right.
When you teach your students and you teach the sustainability class, are they excited about it? Do they find it to be just one more boring thing they need to do, or what?
Well, you know what was really cool about it? For the most part, it was like preaching to the choir. These students in this generation, they're very aware of climate change and really trying to keep the earth in good stead. And it wasn't something that I was introducing to them necessarily. The thing about having a class in sustainability in an apparel program is that when garments are manufactured, basically they're going to start with a design. And that designer has to know about the fabric that it's going to be made from, the processes that are going to be required, all of this. And they can, well, if it's a very large manufacturing company, they might not have any say in the matter, but if it's a smaller place, they can make good decisions. So that, I think, is important.
That may change the price point a bit on the final garment, though. And I wonder if the students think about that at all as they're designing, the cost involved, if they're not, and in addition to whether the processes that are taken to create the garment.
Well,
You know.
that's something that, excuse me, they also learn. As they progress. I'm sorry, they learn how they have to deal with cost. They take classes in that as well. So it's a lot to learn, and they obviously they didn't learn all of this in one class, but they have to learn how to get to where, how to get that information, and that it's an important thing. I think that the idea, and one of the things that really I think had this whole idea of sustainability in the apparel industry had to do with fast fashion. And, we all go back to the Rana Plaza collapse and learned a lot there about that aspect of sustainability, keeping our workers safe that are creating all this stuff. But, fast fashion really got this really bad rap because they're making clothes that are fast to make, very inexpensive in materials, and they didn't last. And they were so inexpensive that people were buying something, wearing it once or twice and throwing it away, and in many cases it would fall apart before they had a chance to throw it away. Now that kind of thing, I think it's important. I always thought it was important that you introduce students to the idea that fewer clothes sometimes is better than more. And I think that should be true for all of us in a way. And I think we've learned that because of COVID, we've learned we can have less in terms of garments. But since I'm a home sewer, I like to make things. And I know that threads readers like to make things, whether they need it or not. It's the process that we go through that is important. And that's where we have to think about, why are we doing what we do? And I think we can still continue to do what we do, and just make, some good decisions along the way. And when it comes to clothing, it's not like we need to make things that we are always going to have, that we can never get rid of what we have and we need to wear it for the rest of our lives. We know that's not going to happen. But we can pass those garments on. When we think about the life cycle of a garment, there is that end of life. And what is that? What is the end of your clothes that you're making when you're not wearing them anymore? Well, hopefully they're going on to somebody else that can wear them. Or, this is another thing I loved about a lot of my students. They were always thrifting. That's what they call it. They would go to Goodwill or other thrift shops in the area, and that's where they would purchase their clothes. And sometimes they could find ways to turn them into something else. And I think this is a wonderful thing that has actually been part of this whole idea of sustainability and then remaking things. For me, that has become what I like to do a lot now, upcycling and turning something into something else. It's so creative. And it's so satisfying to be able to do something like that.
Can you give us an example of one item that you've made recently that you've upcycled?
Well, I've played around with a lot of things, and a few years ago, because when I was teaching this class, and by the way, my class was a studio class, a design class, so it wasn't just learning about all the issues in the garment industry in terms of sustainability, but they actually had projects that they had to do in terms of zero waste, where you leave no scrap, and then upcycling, that was another big one, and a mending project. But so I would always do a project. I mean, even though I knew what I was doing, I wanted to learn more about it. And I did a jeans jacket that was in Threads magazine back a few years ago, where I made a rather tailored looking jacket from a couple pair of my husband's old worn out Levi's. And then I did I call it the opera coat. This was really for the experience of doing it, but I made it out of a prom dress. It was quite fun, and I quilted it and all of that. I recently made a pair of sweatpants out of actually 3 sweatshirts, where the sleeves became the legs, but of course the sleeves weren't long enough even for my short legs. So, you have to piece in some more. I've played with denim in other ways, and I also. I have a couple things in process with t-shirts, and then some old sweaters, cutting them apart. And when I think back on my own various things that I have done, I spent about 10 years in custom business, and I did mostly bridal. But one of my favorite things at that time, and I had no idea about sustainability at that point, but one of my favorite things to do was to remake wedding dresses. When I would have a bride want to wear her mother's dress or her grandmother's dress, or she might have found one in a resale store, and they had to be remade for this new bride. And that was so much fun to do. I realized that it's creative in a way that starting from scratch isn't necessarily.
Mary, at some point you mentioned to me, you mentioned that you had developed something called the Mending Initiative at your school to encourage students to share their skills with the community. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That was a fun thing. And this was early on, the very first semester I taught it. And of course, I did a lot of research for this. Before I started this class, I actually went to an institute at FIT for a week one summer as well that really inspired me. But a big part of sustainability in any area is repair, that we don't throw things away as soon as they need some repair. I grew up with things that had to be mended. They were fixed, and we know that, going back to history, that clothes were always kept as long as they possibly could be, and they were repaired. So first, the students had to do a project where they had to bring in a couple of things that needed repair and mend them. And every once in a while, there'd be somebody that had nothing that needed repair. But I said, fine, get a friend, get a roommate, somebody that has something that's broken. So they would have to photograph the garment, and then repair it and photograph it again, whatever. And they learned quite a few things about that. But the other thing that I wanted them to do was to be able to teach other students how to do this, because this is a big university, and our program was quite a small part of it. So I wanted them to be able to teach others how to fix their clothes. So we started that, and the Mending Initiative, it was called that because I had a group of students that we kind of were kind of the core, and we had some sessions, how are we going to do this, and we actually, and with another faculty member, we did a proposal, and we got some funding for it, so we could buy a couple of sewing machines and a lot of supplies and things just for that. I wanted it to be something that we could take these sewing machines somewhere else. Maybe it was a dorm, maybe another class or something, and we could actually go to them. And then we had situations where we set up a place, and we invited people to come in with things that they needed to repair. I found it to be really interesting because a lot of these students who had never even barely seen a sewing machine before, we would let them sit at the machines and do the sewing themselves. They really took to that and had a great time. And we, taught them how to hand sew things like buttons and fix seams and patch holes and, simple things. We didn't do things like replace a zipper in jeans. All right, that's complicated. And, we didn't have all of those kinds of supplies. But yeah, we would have these mending meets, I would call them, and people could come in during that time. We had a little, another smaller lab, and we used that quite often, and then did some things that were outside of our building. And it was, I think it was a fun project, and my students really liked the idea of being teachers too. They a lot of them took to that. And they were good at it. I was pleased. I think it's true that this is something that anybody could do.
What are some trends in mending that you are seeing a lot of that you like?
Well, I think mostly it's the visible mending, and I have really embraced that too. Because the kinds of things you need to repair are mostly those things you've had for a long time. Those things. I mean, I have a couple of things. I've got a hoodie sweatshirt. It's over 20 years old, and it's perfect for walking. And it didn't have a pocket, so a few years ago I put a pocket on the front of it, and then sweatshirts they wear out at the edges a lot. And you can take some yarn or some embroidery floss and just whip stitch around it and make some other little decorative stitches on it. But I just hesitate to ever get rid of that because it's just so comfortable and so perfect. So I think a lot of the things we want to fix are those items that we just can't imagine living, without. I've mended visibly. I have a sweater that was full of moth holes. Somebody gave it to me, and when I started the sustainability class, and so I learned how to do that needle punching with really colorful wool roving, and it's so easy. I mean, you certainly don't have to have any skill at all, except you need the proper needle and the roving, and you just punch it in to fill in the holes. And so that is a lot of fun. And of course, sewing patches on. The thing about fashion today is, well, we know you don't really have to repair the holes in your jeans because that was a fashion. It's kind of maybe lived itself out now, but we know that there was a time when jeans had more holes than not when you saw them being worn in public. But if you want to patch them, you can do some colorful patching, and it's quite fun. So I think that really is what I'm doing the most. Uh-huh.
I'm remembering the article that you did for us recently, Mary,
Yes.
Artful Mending,
Hmm.
and you give plenty of examples of what you were just talking about. And there is a section in here a little bit about tools and supplies that you would need to just do some basic mending. Could you talk a little bit about some of the supplies you would recommend for someone who hasn't done mending and just wants to get started?
Well, mostly you want to decide how you want to fix it. All right. There are some things that you want to fix as invisibly as possible. You somehow you snagged something or whatever, and of course that means trying to find a thread that is going to be the correct color. I don't think you have to be a real accomplished sewer to do any of this, although there are things when you're trying to do something that's really invisible that finer stitches are going to, make a difference. I think having different kinds of of threads. I like the embroidery floss or even pearl cotton. When I do these borrow projects, I like pearl cotton for that. It shows up a little bit more when you're doing stitches that you want to be visible. Then, of course, I don't think there are too many sewers out there that don't have a button box of some kind. I grew up with button jars. That was when my grandmother would have clothes that were kind of at their end, and they were going to be turned into rags, not just sewn out, but turned into rags. The buttons came off first, and you threw them in a button jar. So, that type of thing, that because buttons come off, it doesn't matter how. I mean, I've had them come off when I've sewed them on myself, and that's, kind of defeating, but anyway, it happens. So you need that. And, things like those things that garments come with. Maybe it's hooks and eyes, maybe it's snaps, that kind of thing. And the needle punching, that is just kind of a set of needles and then some kind of a foam something or other, or a thick felted board. I use that. The magazine talks about this kit that I purchased for doing that. But you can also take some felt fabric and kind of roll it up so you have a really thick kind of base, because when you're punching that yarn into the holes, the needle is going to go through it, and you have to have something, a base for that needle. So I think those are kind of the most important things, just to have things on hand like needles and thread, and then whatever you use when you're hand sewing. I can't hand sew without a thimble, but that's not, necessary for everyone. And then just being able to look at what it is that you're going to fix and say, oh, this would be kind of fun. You're not going to do it maybe your best suit or something. You're not going to probably sew a flashy patch on it. But for a lot of the everyday kind of things we wear and the fun things we wear, they're pretty easy to repair. I also think that if you're going to send a garment to Goodwill or to another thrift kind of store or resale store or whatever, it's your obligation to make sure it's in good condition. Even sewing a patch on it that is kind of visible, I think that's worth doing. I mean, somebody's going to buy it because of that or not, but make sure that it's not a pile of rags. Although I have clothes that do end up as rags. And another thing that I did, and I have some of them here, I was telling Carol about it, these little white squares, I realized that I used at least a couple of those cotton squares a day in removing makeup or, applying toner to my face. And then what do you do with those? Even though they're cotton, you throw them away. And they're not reusable. And I thought, well, I should have something that's reusable. And so I had some of my husband's really worn out, they're the white t-shirts, undershirt t-shirts. And I washed them, and I cut the big chunks out of, the back and the front, and I had 3 layers of this cotton, and then sewed a grid. So it was kind of like quilting it, but not really. It was just making a grid so that then I could cut between, and you have to have like 2 rows of stitches, so then I could just cut them out. It didn't take very long. But I have been, it's been very satisfying to use these. And then when I need to clean them, I throw them in a lingerie bag and wash them and get another stack. So
I was going to say that the mending, visible or invisible, or the making of something out of something else is circular in a lot of ways, because it keeps your garments and your fabrics from going into the trash and to be disposed of. But it also makes you care about them more and love them more because you put that extra effort into them. And so you're going to try even harder to prevent them from being thrown away ultimately. I know I have jeans from when I was a teenager that I wish I could give to my daughter because I embroidered on them and I put patches, but they won't fit her, so it's not going to work out. But that would have been, a goal.
Right. I think that's it. Well, right now I'm wearing, you can't see because I'm sitting down, but those pants that are in that article that you just showed, Janine, where I started off by just trying to fix this worn area below the pocket, and I just used a really colorful satin stitch. But then, in order to make that make sense, I did a lot more stitching on it. But the point was that the pants themselves were a heavy kind of linen when I first purchased them, and I loved them. But over the years, they I grew in and out of them, if you know what I mean. There were times where they didn't fit, and I removed the waistband at one point and did a little facing, and then at one point they were kind of loose, and I wanted them to be a little shorter, and I cut them off, but it's a very comfortable linen, and linen's a fabric like that. I think linen gets better as it ages, and so you want to care for it. And when I say care for it, and that's another part of sustainability too. How do we care for those clothes that we have? When you think about the life cycle of a garment, it's not just the fiber, the manufacture, the marketing, the selling, all of those kinds of things. But what do you do with it once you have it, whether you've made it or purchased it? How do you care for it? And those kinds of things also add to whatever is harming the environment sometimes. I mean, how much water are you using to wash those things all the time? Do you need to wash, do we need to wash our clothes as much as we do? But and then there's the drying and the ironing. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. Obviously, we have to. But these are all part of a garment. And sometimes what we do at home to clean our clothes is just as toxic as what a dry cleaners might do. We just don't think of it because we think of washing and being clean as being kind of pure, right? But all of those kinds of things go into that life cycle of a garment, and making it a little bit easier, and maybe using different kinds of detergents or soaps or whatever. Putting some thought in. And Carol, I think you started talking before about what the home sewer can do, and I think that it's just being aware. I learned so much teaching this class, not really understanding what was going on in the industry, the textile industry, the garment industry. When you're aware of what is happening, doesn't mean you're going to stop doing certain things, but you're going to do them a little more carefully, I guess, in the decisions that you make. And you're going to feel good about it. And you're going to have fun with it too, I think. I think being, trying to be sustainable can be really kind of fun. So.
Well, I think you make it sound like it is, Mary, and I think that, and I feel like being thoughtful is really where it all starts for somebody at home who's trying to figure out a better way to be a
Right.
responsible sewer. We're coming to the end of our time, and we didn't get to talk about, for example, your fabric stash and how you use scraps. So we will catch up with you another time, I hope, and talk about that a little bit, because I think you have some great ideas of, don't throw away those small pieces and figure out fun ways to make them meaningful in your wardrobe and in your life.
Right.
So I hope we will talk about that sometime too soon.
Great.
Yeah. So
Okay.
thank you so much for talking with us, Mary. We appreciate you coming and joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Follow Threads on social media and visit threadsmagazine.com to view show notes for this episode. While you're on the site, check out Threads Insider, our online membership with exclusive access to expert sewing techniques. Until next time, keep on sewing with threads.